We're watching Press TV's News Review, where we look deeper into some of the top stories of the day. On this segment of the program, foreign ministers from BRICS countries are meeting in South Africa as the bloc seeks to counterweight the West. South African authorities have confirmed the presence of top diplomats from Brazil, Russia, and India, as well as a Chinese deputy minister in Thursday's meeting in Cape Town. The talks are prelude to a leaders' summit to be held in Johannesburg in August. No agenda has been made public, but discussions are expected to focus on ties among members and an expansion of the group. BRICS is an acronym for 5 economies of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It has gradually turned into a more cohesive geopolitical bloc. BRICS leaders have already hinted about admitting new members, including Iran and Venezuela. South Africa has invited the Iranian foreign minister to attend the meeting. Hossein Amir Abdullahian is scheduled to hold bilateral talks with his BRICS counterparts. Joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have John Ross, Senior Fellow at Chongyang Institute at Renmin University of China, who's joining us from Beijing. We also have Anthony von Newkirk, Research Fellow at Wits School of Governance, joining us from Pretoria. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with John Ross in Beijing. What are you expecting to see on the agenda of this BRICS meeting? And tell us about the significance of it as well.
Well, it's extremely significant, both objectively and also from the point of view of its potential in the situation. I mean, the BRICS economies are going to account for more economic world growth during the next 5 years than the whole of the G7. I mean, that's not my estimate. It's the IMF's estimate, which can't be accused of being biased, particularly against the G7. Also, you've got a situation in which these economies are in general speeding up. China's economy is coming out of the COVID situation faster than it was last year. India has just posted rather good economic growth results, whereas the United States and Europe are slowing down because of the big interest rate rises. And then you've got what you might call a political trend, which I think is happening in the world, which I would refer to as a new non-aligned movement, which is, you saw particularly around the question of sanctions against Russia and earlier against sanctions against Iran, the countries are just refusing to go along with the sanctions policies of the United States. They're not necessarily going to be pro-China or pro-Brazil or pro-India, but what they're not going to be is they're not going to be told what to do by the United States. So there's a political dimension here, an economic dimension, that these are the largest developing economies, and also what I would call a political development. Some people call the Global South, some people would call the new non-aligned movement, but it's basically the same process.
Mr. Van Newkirk, give us your thoughts on the significance of this BRICS meeting. As our guest in Beijing mentioned, it's not just an economic angle, but there's a political angle to this as well, a major political angle.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and greetings to my colleague in Beijing. This afternoon in South Africa, around about 3 o'clock, the foreign ministers will have a meeting in preparation for the BRICS summit, which will take place in August in Johannesburg. Of course, there's a political angle to this because South Africa is in a diplomatic pickle or a difficulty, because it is a member of the International Criminal Court and is expected to execute a warrant of arrest when President Putin arrives on our shores. So there's turmoil politically, because the South African government wants to receive, has invited, and President Putin has agreed to attend the summit. But South Africa, the government is trying to work out how to circumvent this legal challenge brought by the ICC. It's part of a much bigger conversation, I must say, about the relevance and the value of the International Criminal Court, and from an African perspective, the question really is whether South Africa shouldn't rather promote the growth or the establishment of an indigenous court that can deal with human rights abuses on the continent. But that's part of a bigger discussion. I'm assuming for this conversation that the summit takes place in August in South Africa, in Johannesburg. All the BRICS leaders attend, including President Putin, and the agenda will then proceed with, I see, 2 very important issues on the table. We haven't seen the agenda. As I said, the foreign ministers are meeting today. They will set the agenda, I think. That's their job. But we know that there are two issues. The one is how to promote global development and how to promote economic recovery, particularly from the perspective of developing and emerging economies. And the second one, which everybody is looking at very eagerly, is the expansion of BRICS membership.
Sure. Mr. Newkirk, staying with you, how important of a role can a group like BRICS play in this new emerging economic order?
Thinking about it, until now, you know, the so-called rules-based international order, which is really a nice phrase, which means American hegemony, is being carried out by vehicles such as the G7 or the G20 or Davos. And BRICS has played a secondary role in the process because it's really focused on the interests of the 5 members itself. But now, given that, that the world order is changing in front of our eyes, I think our colleague in Beijing talks about a new non-aligned sort of movement or approach. And indeed, the global south is not falling in line with the dictates of America or Europe, or if you want, NATO. It now means that in this very fractured, volatile, uncertain, and very challenging international environment, the opportunity has arisen for BRICS to play a much more important counterweight role, if you want, to the dominance of the Americans and the Europeans, or NATO, if you want. And in that respect, inviting very important non-BRICS members from the global south to join the alliance, in particular those countries that have natural resources, oil, gas, and other natural resources, and play important regional leadership roles, including Iran, but also others in Africa. If BRICS then expands into what I call BRICS Plus, and we don't have 30 new members, but a significant number of strategically chosen new members that will join BRICS after the summit, not during, but after the summit, then I think the BRICS alliance will then rise in terms of geopolitical and geoeconomic importance to actually provide that counter to what is happening with the American drive to neutralize or isolate Russia in preparation for a bigger war against China in coming years. And in that respect, BRICS will play a very, very important role representing the interests of the global south.
Sure. Back to Mr. John Ross in Beijing. It was yesterday, if I'm correct, where the Brazilian president was calling at a Mercosur meeting for Southern American countries to come up with a common currency. How important can groups like Mercosur or like BRICS play in breaking the hegemony of the greenback in global trade?
Well, there's 2 different questions there. One is what is happening with global trade, and what is the second is what's happening with the dollar. As regards the dollar, I would be less optimistic than I would wish to be about the question that the dollar disappearing. I don't think it's going to happen soon. I would like it to happen, but I don't honestly believe it. And in these things, you've got to be realistic. The second thing is, however, the question of regional trade. That is extremely important. You already have in ASEAN and in Asia the world's most successful trading bloc, which is expanded into the regional comprehensive economic partnership. Obviously, if you look at the countries in Africa and in Latin America, none of those countries is large enough by itself to really be a sufficiently large market in the modern scale economy, what I would call a continental scale economy. So you're seeing the integration. For example, Latin America, that was the purpose of the summit that was called by President Lula. That's one of the discussions. And secondly, there are movements on that question in Africa, of which I'm not so well informed as I'm sure your other guest is. But the question of regional trade and development is extremely important. I think it's a somewhat separate question to the question of the dollar, of which I think some things which are not totally realistic are being discussed.
All right. Thanks, gentlemen. We're going to have to leave it there. John Ross, Senior Fellow at Chongyang Institute at Renmin University of China, speaking to us from Beijing. And thanks to Anthony von Newkirk, Research Fellow at Wits School of Governance, speaking to us from Pretoria. And with that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review. But stick around, there's plenty more to come here on Press TV.